priest accused of molesting more than 130 children is under growing pressure to resign himself.
August 23, 2003. Inside the walls of Souza-Baranowski Correctional Center, Massachusetts' most secure prison, a door was jammed shut from the inside. Guards rushed down the tier, pounding on metal, but no one could get in. Behind that door, a frail 68-year-old inmate was fighting for his life. By the time officers forced it open, it was too late. The man on the floor was John Geoghan, once a Catholic priest, now one of the most despised figures in America. His crimes against children had not only destroyed lives but also pulled back the curtain on decades of church cover-ups. His name had become a symbol of betrayal, corruption, and abuse. But Geoghan's end didn't come by lethal injection, or by the cold ritual of a state execution. His final moments were delivered by another prisoner, a man who believed he was carrying out his own form of justice. So the question remains, what exactly happened in the final 24 hours of John Geoghan? What did he eat, what did he say, and how did his final moments unfold inside a locked cell on Boston's so-called death row? John Joseph Geoghan was born in Boston in 1935, and for much of his life, he wore the collar of a Catholic priest. To the outside world, he was meant to be a spiritual guide, a man trusted with baptisms, confessions, and communion. But behind closed doors, Geoghan lived a double life. For decades, he preyed on the very children he was supposed to protect. Victims later described him as manipulative, calculating, and relentless. Some were as young as 6 or 7 years old. His pattern of abuse stretched across parish after parish, with church officials quietly transferring him each time accusations surfaced, not to protect the children, but to shield the institution. By the late 1990s, whispers of abuse had become a roar. Investigations revealed that Geoghan had molested more than 130 boys over 3 decades. His name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption, a living symbol of the Boston clergy abuse scandal that would shake the Catholic Church to its foundations. In January 2002, after years of survivors fighting to be heard, Geoghan was finally convicted of indecent assault and battery on a 10-year-old boy. The court sentenced him to 9 to 10 years in state prison. At 67 years old, thin and frail, he entered the system not as a man of God, but as one of the most despised inmates in America. And though he was placed in protective custody, his reputation followed him everywhere. Inside those walls, he wasn't just another prisoner. He was a target. After his conviction, John Geoghan was transferred to Souza-Baranowski Correctional Center, Massachusetts' most secure prison. This was no ordinary facility. It was designed to house the state's most dangerous inmates, men serving long stretches for murder, armed robbery, and organized crime. Because of his notoriety, Geoghan wasn't placed in the general population. Instead, he was sent to protective custody, a wing reserved for inmates considered vulnerable, child molesters, ex-police officers, and those at high risk of being attacked. In theory, it was meant to keep him safe. In reality, it only marked him as prey. Inside the prison system, there are few labels more hated than child molester. Word spreads fast. And when Geoghan's name appeared on the unit, everyone knew who he was. Guards whispered about him. Inmates eyed him with open contempt. Even in protective custody, his reputation as the face of the Boston clergy scandal made him a walking target. And watching him closely was Joseph Druce. A 37-year-old serving life without parole for killing a man in a hate crime, Druce was already volatile and violent. He harbored deep anger toward child abusers, and as reports later revealed, he had been planning something for weeks. August 23, 2003. The day began like so many others inside Souza-Baranowski. Inmates in protective custody were woken early, meals served on metal trays, the rhythm of the prison routine as predictable as clockwork. For John Geoghan, now 68 and frail, that routine had become his entire world. He ate quietly, kept to himself, and spent most of his hours isolated in his cell. He was soft-spoken, almost timid, a stark contrast to the monstrous reputation that hung over him. Prison staff later described him as someone who avoided confrontation, a man who seemed to know that his survival depended on being invisible. But while Geoghan lived in silence, Joseph Druce was watching. For weeks, Druce had studied him, noting when the guards made their rounds, when cell doors were opened, and when inmates were most vulnerable. On that final morning, Geoghan followed his routine as usual. Breakfast passed without incident. He remained in his cell, shuffling papers, resting, and waiting for lunch. Other inmates would later recall him appearing nervous but quiet, not knowing that his killer had already chosen the day. When the lunch trays were delivered, the routine once again gave Druce his opening. As guards moved prisoners back to their cells, Druce kept his eyes locked on Geoghan. He had prepared a makeshift wedge, something he could use to jam the cell door. And as Geoghan returned to his small, sterile cell with his midday meal, Druce knew the moment he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. In death row stories, the last meal is a ritual, a final comfort before the state carries out its sentence. But for John Geoghan, there would be no official request, no special menu, and no ceremony. His last meal was the same as every other inmate in protective custody that afternoon. He ate it quietly in his cell, not knowing it would be his last. Hours later, the man who had consumed that bland prison lunch would be lying on the floor of his cell, bound and beaten, with no chance to reflect on it. His last meal was never intended to carry meaning, but in the story of his death, it became a final marker of inevitability. For many death row inmates, the last words are formal, delivered through a microphone, witnessed by guards, reporters, and family members. But for John Geoghan, there would be no microphone, no official statement, no final chance at redemption. His last words, if they can be called that, came not in a chamber but inside a prison cell, muffled, panicked, and drowned in violence. When Joseph Druce forced his way into the cell and jammed the door shut, Geoghan tried to cry out. Witnesses later recalled the faint sounds of a struggle, banging, muffled shouts, and then silence. As Druce bound his hands and gagged his mouth, reports from the investigation state that Geoghan gasped for air as Druce strangled him and stomped on his chest. In those moments, the only words he managed were broken pleas, fragments, choked cries that quickly dissolved into nothing. No prayers, no confessions, no speeches of regret. Just the desperate sounds of a man fighting to breathe. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. For a priest who once claimed to be a shepherd of the faithful, his final words were not sermons of faith but gasps of survival. His legacy, already destroyed by decades of abuse, ended without grace, without closure, and without absolution. John Geoghan's last words were never truly spoken. They were swallowed by violence, leaving behind only silence and the weight of crimes that would forever outlive him. After lunch, the protective custody unit was quiet. Doors were locked, guards on rotation, the hum of prison life steady and predictable. But Joseph Druce had been waiting. He spotted his moment when inmates were returning to their cells. Druce slipped into John Geoghan's cell, carrying with him not a weapon of steel, but a plan. He wedged a piece of cardboard and paper into the doorframe, jamming it shut from the inside. Geoghan was trapped, cut off from the protection of guards, alone with the man who had come for him. The assault began swiftly. Druce overpowered the frail 68-year-old priest, binding his hands behind his back with a prison-issued sheet. He gagged him to silence any cries for help, reducing Geoghan's voice to muffled, desperate sounds. Then came the strangulation. Druce wrapped cloth around his neck, tightening until Geoghan gasped for air. But he didn't stop there. Druce climbed onto the bed and launched his body downward, stomping on Geoghan's chest with all his weight, again and again. Each strike crushed his ribs, collapsing what little breath he had left. For several minutes, the attack continued, guards pounding on the door, shouts echoing in the corridor, but no one able to get inside. Druce kept the assault going until Geoghan lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. It was a violent end, one that mirrored the suffering Geoghan had inflicted on others throughout his life. And in those few minutes, the walls of Souza-Baranowski witnessed a form of prison justice that was as merciless as it was final. It didn't take long before other inmates and guards realized something was wrong. Shouts echoed through the protective custody unit, and the sound of struggle carried down the tier. Officers rushed to Geoghan's cell, but when they tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The lock had been jammed. Druce's improvised wedge held firm, buying him precious minutes while chaos erupted outside. Guards pounded on the steel door, keys rattled in the slot, control panels were triggered, but nothing worked. Behind the barrier, they could only hear muffled thuds, the sounds of violence, and then, chillingly, silence. More officers arrived. Tools were brought in. Together, they forced the frame and finally pried the door open. The scene inside stunned even the most hardened corrections officers. John Geoghan lay on the floor, bound and gagged, his body battered and motionless. Emergency protocols were triggered immediately. Medics rushed in, performing CPR and trying to restart a pulse. He was loaded onto a stretcher, carried through the secure corridors, and placed into an ambulance. But the damage was irreversible. At 1:17 p.m., at a nearby hospital, John Geoghan was pronounced dead. The news spread quickly. A disgraced priest, once protected by powerful men in the church, had met his end not in quiet old age, but on the floor of a prison cell. When questioned, Joseph Druce made no attempt to hide what he had done. He admitted that he had planned the attack for weeks, studying Geoghan's movements and waiting for the right moment. His motive, he said, was simple: he wanted to send a message. To him, men like Geoghan, child abusers, did not deserve protection. Druce had taken it upon himself to deliver what he believed the system could not: justice. The confession sparked immediate controversy. On one side, many members of the public, and even some prison staff, quietly admitted they were not surprised, and in some cases, not entirely saddened, by Geoghan's fate. To them, Druce had punished a man who had destroyed countless lives and evaded full accountability for decades. But for others, the killing raised troubling questions. Survivors of Geoghan's abuse were divided. Some felt that his violent death was fitting, a final reckoning for the pain he had caused. Others felt cheated, robbed of the chance to see him stand trial for additional charges, to face his victims in court, and to publicly acknowledge his crimes. His murder cut short the judicial process, leaving many wounds still open. The Catholic Church, already reeling from scandal, now faced another storm. Headlines exploded across the country. The death of John Geoghan became more than just a prison killing, it became a symbol. For some, it was justice served in a locked cell. For others, it was yet another failure to truly hold him accountable in a court of law. In the end, his death didn't bring clarity. It only deepened the divide between justice and revenge, leaving victims, families, and the public to wrestle with what it really meant. John Geoghan's name will forever be tied to betrayal. As a priest, he abused his position of trust to harm children. His crimes shattered families, scarred lives, and pulled back the veil on a system of cover-ups that reached the highest levels of the Catholic Church. His case became the spark that ignited one of the largest sexual abuse scandals in modern history. His death was not the justice many victims had sought, but it became part of a wider conversation about what justice really looks like, especially when the legal system fails to account for the full weight of someone's crimes. In the end, John Geoghan's final 24 hours were defined not by repentance, confession, or forgiveness, but by brutality. His life was taken in the same kind of violence that his own actions had inflicted on others: sudden, merciless, and irreversible. For some, his death brought closure. For others, it left only more questions. Was it justice, was it revenge, or was it something in between? Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was John Geoghan's death true justice, a brutal act of revenge, or something caught in between? Share your thoughts down in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more chilling true crime stories from death row and beyond, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Mr. Cold Case.